Washington did what Washington does best this week. We bought ourselves a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, and we paid for it with a $1.2 trillion check that keeps the lights on for the Pentagon, but leaves the fuse burning on the most explosive issue in American politics. I'm Greg Donovan, and if you're looking for someone to tell you that everything is fine because the National Mall is open and the partial shutdown is technically over, you're in the wrong place. My assessment, based on the whip counts I've seen and the panicked text messages coming out of the Capitol since Tuesday, is that we have simply traded a general governance crisis for a targeted political war. President Trump signed the package, yes, and it keeps the Departments of Defense, Education, and Health and Human Services running through September. But there was a carve-out, a strategic amputation that you need to understand. The Department of Homeland Security is only funded through February 13. That is a ticking clock with less than 10 days left on it. And unlike the previous deadlines, the mechanics of this next fight are rigged in a way that almost guarantees a collision. Before I dissect exactly how Speaker Mike Johnson and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries are maneuvering their troops into a kill-box over ICE funding, I need you to do something for me. If you want the kind of analysis that ignores the press release fluff and looks strictly at the leverage and the leverage points, hit that subscribe button on the channel right now. I want to know who I'm talking to. Drop a comment below and tell me your location. Are you watching this from a border district in Texas where this policy hits home? Or are you in a suburb in Philly wondering why your representatives can't just get the job done? Like this video, share it with your network, and let's get the numbers up so we can keep bringing you this raw intel. Let's look at the hard data. The vote count on the House floor Tuesday was 217 to 214. That is not a governing majority. That is a rounding error. Speaker Johnson barely scraped this $1.2 trillion package across the finish line, and he only did it by severing the DHS funding from the main herd. Why? Because the political radiation from the Minneapolis incident is still too high. You cannot understand the legislative gridlock we are facing next week without understanding the granular details of what happened on the ground in Minnesota. We aren't just talking about budget line items. We are talking about the shooting deaths of Renee on January 7th and Alex Pretti on January 24th. These two events have fundamentally altered the leverage map for the Democrats. Before January, the debate was about border security in the abstract. Now, it is about Operation Metro Surge and the specific tactical behaviors of federal agents. The latest reports from ProPublica and the hearings being prepped by the Oversight Committee have identified the agents involved in the Pretti shooting as Ochoa and Raimundo Gutierrez. This level of specific identification, naming the agents, detailing the tactical response nature of their unit, has poured gasoline on the fire within the Democratic caucus. Leader Jeffries cannot, under any circumstances, whip votes for a clean DHS funding extension next week. I've spoken to sources close to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and their position is absolute. No money for DHS without statutory requirements for body cameras, warrant mandates for interior enforcement, and a demobilization of these surge units in non-border cities. If Jeffries tries to bypass them and cut a deal with Johnson, his leadership is in jeopardy. That is the internal pressure cooker on the left. But here is the counter-pressure, and this is the piece of data that the cable news pundits are missing completely. It is the one big beautiful bill. Remember that? The reconciliation package passed in the summer of 2025. Buried in that massive legislative architecture was a provision that allocated roughly $75 billion in multi-year mandatory funding, specifically for ICE and border enforcement operations. This is the strategic game changer. It means that the February 13 deadline is a soft cliff for the Republicans. If Congress fails to pass a funding bill for DHS next week, the administrative staff at DHS headquarters might get furloughed, and the Coast Guard might miss a paycheck, which is a political nightmare, admittedly. But the actual enforcement agents, the deportation officers, the surge teams, are largely insulated because they can draw down on that $75 billion reserve. This creates a perverse incentive structure for the White House and the House Freedom Caucus. They know that a shutdown of DHS won't actually stop the deportations or the operations that the Democrats are protesting. In fact, it might accelerate them, as the administration argues they are using emergency authorities. Speaker Johnson has the leverage here. He can look at Jeffries and say, "Go ahead, block the funding. The agents stay on the street, but you'll be explaining to the voters why FEMA can't process disaster claims." It is a brutal, cynical, and highly effective trap. The 217-214 vote we saw this week proves that Johnson has zero margin for error within his own party. He cannot afford to lose the hardliners who want to see maximum pressure applied. He needs that $75 billion backstop to keep his right flank calm while he squeezes the Democrats. Now, let's talk about the economic reality of what a DHS lapse looks like, because this is where the real-world impact hits your wallet. Even with the $75 billion reserve for enforcement, a lapse in appropriations on February 13th hits the trade facilitation side of DHS hard. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, officers at the ports of entry, the people scanning the containers at Long Beach and checking the trucks in Laredo, are considered essential, so they will work, but they will work without pay. My assessment, based on the sick-out rates we saw during the 35-day shutdown a few years ago, is that we will see a spike in blue flu. When customs agents call in sick, lanes close. When lanes close, wait times for freight go from 30 minutes to 4 hours. I was looking at the logistics data from the conference board, and they are already pricing in a 15% reduction in cross-border throughput, starting February 14th if this isn't resolved. For the auto industry, which relies on just-in-time parts crossing the border multiple times a day, this is a disaster. For the agricultural sector, specifically perishable goods coming up from Mexico, a 4-hour delay can ruin a shipment. The business community knows this. The Chamber of Commerce is furiously lobbying Johnson to get a deal done, but the business lobby has lost its grip on the House GOP. The ideological imperative of the border fight is currently outweighing the economic imperative of trade flow. That is a dangerous shift in the tectonic plates of the Republican coalition. Let's pivot back to the political strategy. Why did they carve out DHS specifically? Why not just do a CR for the whole government? Because the partial shutdown that started January 31st was hurting the wrong people politically. It was affecting national parks, angry tourists, the IRS, delayed tax refunds, and the NIH. By passing the $1.2 trillion minibus for defense, labor, and health, Congress cleared the battlefield of the sympathetic victims. Now, the only hostages left are the DHS employees and the immigrants themselves. This was a tactical decision to isolate the conflict zone. It allows both parties to fight the culture war over immigration without the distraction of seniors complaining about Social Security offices being closed, since the SSA is now funded. This focus on the culture war brings us back to Alex Pretti and Renee. The political potency of their deaths cannot be overstated. Pretti was a VA nurse, an institutionalist, a guy who worked for the federal government. He wasn't an anarchist throwing Molotov cocktails. He was a nurse filming an arrest who got shot 10 times. The optics of this, as cold as that term is, are devastating for the administration. The video analysis showing agents firing on him while he was on the ground has radicalized suburban voters who usually side with law enforcement. My polling data from the key swing districts in Pennsylvania and Michigan, districts that Trump won narrowly, shows a 12-point swing against unrestricted enforcement since the Pretti shooting. This is why the Democrats feel they must fight on February 13th. They believe the public is finally with them on curbing ICE tactics. However, the Republicans have their own data. They are looking at the chaos numbers. When voters see protests, burning cars, and clashes in Minneapolis, they don't always blame the police. Often they blame the disorder itself and crave a strong hand. The Trump strategy is to bet that by February 13th, the narrative will have shifted from tragic shooting to cities out of control. If there is more unrest in Minneapolis between now and the deadline, the GOP's hand strengthens. They will argue that now is not the time to handcuff our police with body cam bureaucracy. It is a race to define the narrative reality before the legislative deadline expires. So, what is the endgame here? How does this actually resolve? I see 3 scenarios, and none of them are clean. Scenario 1 is the kick the can. They pass another continuing resolution, CR, for DHS, maybe extending funding to March or April. This is the path of least resistance. It requires some Democrats to cave, perhaps in exchange for a token concession like a study on body cameras rather than a mandate. But given the anger in the base, Jeffries might not be able to deliver the votes for this, and Johnson has promised his right flank no more CRs. Scenario 2 is the partial lapse. This is my highest probability assessment. On February 13th, the funding expires. The Democrats refuse to vote for a bill without reforms. The Republicans refuse to include them. The deadline passes. DHS technically shuts down. But, and this is critical, because of the $75 billion reserve fund I mentioned, the enforcement raids continue. The administration makes a show of keeping the tough parts of DHS running while shutting down the bureaucracy. They weaponize the shutdown to purge the parts of the agency they dislike, policy shops, civil rights offices, while keeping the deportation machine running. This drags on for weeks, turning into a war of attrition that tests the Democrats' resolve. Scenario 3 is the grand bargain, and frankly, I don't see the numbers for it. A grand bargain would involve the Senate, where the filibuster still necessitates 60 votes, forcing a compromise that includes the body cam language, but gives the Republicans more money for the wall or detention beds. But the trust between the chambers is at an all-time low. The Senate passed their version of the bill, 71-29, a wide bipartisan margin. The House scraped by with 217-214. The House is the bottleneck. The House Freedom Caucus views any concession on policing tactics as a surrender to the anti-police left. They would rather shut the department down than vote for oversight. I want to touch on the specific legislative mechanics of that 217-214 vote again, because it tells you everything about the next 2 years. Johnson lost 21 Republicans on that vote. He only passed the $1.2 trillion package because 21 Democrats crossed the aisle to save him. Think about that symmetry. The governance coalition is exactly equal to the chaos coalition. But for the DHS vote next week, those 21 Democrats who saved Johnson on the minibus are the exact same moderates who are under the most pressure to respond to the Pretti shooting. These are members from suburban districts where the video of the shooting has been playing on loop on the nightly news. They cannot save Johnson on DHS. If Johnson loses his 21 hardliners, he has nowhere to go. The math simply does not exist for a bipartisan DHS bill right now. This is why I say the victory lap earlier this week was an illusion. The $1.2 trillion package was the easy part. It was the low-hanging fruit of keeping the military and the health department running. The core conflict of the Trump presidency, the tension between aggressive executive power and civil rights oversight, has been distilled into this single agency, DHS, and this single deadline, February 13th. And don't overlook the sanctuary city rider that Johnson is floating. He has signaled he wants to attach a provision that strips federal funding from any city that doesn't cooperate with the Metro Surge operations. If that rider is in the bill, the Democratic vote count goes to zero. Zero. Jeffries cannot allow his members to vote for a bill that defunds New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. If Johnson insists on that rider, we are guaranteed a shutdown. And the suspicion among my sources is that Johnson wants to insist on it, precisely because he knows it provokes a shutdown that he thinks he can win. The fallout from this will define the 2026 midterm cycle. We are seeing the early skirmishes of the campaign right now. If the Democrats can successfully frame the DHS fight as Republicans protecting rogue agents who kill nurses, they have a winning message for the suburbs. If Republicans frame it as Democrats defunding Homeland Security in the middle of a border crisis, they have a winning message for the working class. The February 13th deadline is not about money. It is the opening bell of the 2026 election. So, here is my final assessment. Prepare for a lapse. The structural forces, the $75 billion reserve, the 217-214 vote margin, the radicalization of both bases over the Minneapolis shootings, all point toward a breakdown in negotiations. The markets might get jittery around February 12th, but the real pain will be in the slow grind of the supply chain in the weeks that follow. I'll be watching the Rules Committee meetings on Monday closely. If they structure the rule to allow amendments on the DHS bill, it's a sign they are trying to let the members blow off steam and find a deal. If they bring it to the floor under a closed rule, take it or leave it, then we know the fix is in and the shutdown is the plan. I'll keep you posted as the whip counts change. This is Greg Donovan, signing off from a very nervous Washington.